We relate to each other by reading each other's bodies. But I think it is important to ask ourselves, why? Is this just something natural, or is it something historically constituted? The discourse, a language of sexuality, only emerged in the Western world at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, with the rise of industrialism, with the rise of capitalism, with the rise of something that we call modernity. The presumption here is that what one does for sexual pleasure defines who you are at your innermost core. That is a historically specific form of understanding personhood, subjecthood.
Hi, and welcome to Unisonar, the podcast of the University of Basel. This season, we're diving into research fields related to gender, and we've got experts from the University of Basel to help us explore various aspects of this topic. Let's start with a question that's rarely asked by strangers, but that plays a huge role in our society. Are you a man, a woman, or do you identify outside the binary gender spectrum? Sexuality shapes many aspects of our social lives, but why is that? Is this the case in all societies? And how are Christopher Columbus and his descendants involved? Today, I'll be discussing this with George Paul Meiu, Professor of Anthropology. His research focuses on sexuality, gender, and the commodification of ethnic sexuality. Welcome, George Paul Meiu.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
My name is Katrin Weyer, and on Unisonar, we take a deep dive into the research of experts from the University of Basel. George Paul Meiu, why are we so obsessed with sex?
This is an interesting question, and I like the word obsessed. Has an interesting ring to it. We live indeed in a society that is obsessed with sex. And when I say society, I'm not referring to a particular part of the world. I'm not referring necessarily to Europe, where we are right now. I'm referring to a global order that everywhere is now obsessed, to use your word, with sex, with sexuality. What is that obsession all about? Well, we see it from the very idea that the way we think about ourselves as modern human subjects, as having a sexuality within ourselves, that the deepest truth of who we are, who we can be, is somewhere in us, in this thing we call sex or sexuality. The fact that some of the biggest political battles we are witnessing across the world these days are playing out in the name of, among other things, sexuality, whether it is fights for the traditional family or against so-called gender ideology, or, on the contrary, the idea that our deepest freedom can be expressed primarily in terms of who we are and what we can do sexually. But also, if you look at consumption, right? Sex sells, our advertising, our commodities are veiled in the cloth of erotics, of sexuality, of seduction. If we look at religion and spirituality, where sex and sexuality, whether in the positive or negative ways, becomes central to the discourse of how we are to relate to divinity, to God, and so on, sex is everywhere. So indeed, the word that you use is quite pertinent. We are a society, we are a global world order at this historical juncture that is obsessed with sex, obsessed with sexuality. And, as social scientists, as scholars, as students, we might want to ask ourselves, why?
And you said we are now obsessed with sex. So was there a time when that wasn't the case?
Absolutely. So I think this is an important thing to remember. It's very easy to say, well, of course we're obsessed with sex and sexuality. Isn't sexuality natural? Shouldn't we express it rather than repress it? Shouldn't we affirm it rather than be ashamed of the fact that, we have something called sex or sexual feelings? The very category, that discursive category in language of sex and sexuality, did not exist in every place and at all times. And this is something that anthropology, for example, my field, is very interested in, and it's something important to remember. But probably the most classic book that one can refer to is Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, that tells us that a discourse, a language of sexuality, only emerged in the Western world at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, with the rise of industrialism, with the rise of capitalism, with the rise of something that we call modernity. Meaning, therefore, that in other places and other times, those things that we now classify together as sex or sexuality might not have been classified together. Some might have had things to do with divinity, experiencing spirituality. Some might have had something to do with ritual. Other things might have had something to do with reproduction. But this bringing them together and classifying them as a thing, and furthermore, remember, placing that thing as something that is our deepest, truest sort of self or layer of personhood, that is something that is historically specific, although now it is something that is globalized. You encounter it in commodity markets, in medicine, in law, whether we're talking about India or Brazil, whether we're talking about, Bulgaria or Canada, all across the world.
How did that happen?
That happened first and foremost with the kind of globalization of certain forms of governance and the globalization of a particular kind of market with colonialism. And with this idea of modernity that is something, we imagine modernity like a straight path. Have you become a bit more modern, or are you still in your traditional, right? And you can be somewhere more or less on that path. But we do think of the world, once we inhabit this kind of modernist, let's say, ontology, way of being in the world, we kind of tend to think of things in that way. And again, this is not just, it emerged in the Euro-American world, but it is something now that you encounter globally.
How do you explain that success?
That's a difficult question because, and it is success to a sense, success quote unquote, in the sense of how did it manage to be so effective?
Exactly,
and that has to do with the violence of colonialism, the imposition of particular worldviews alongside the expansion of particular extractive markets, the expansion of particular kinds of worldviews. I think of Christianization, missionization went hand in hand with the inculcation of particular gender and sexual orders. It's not just you become saved and you become a Christian, so you're no longer into your pagan sort of rituals and beliefs, but it is very much about how do you clean your house? How do you relate to your spouse? Do you raise your children properly? Are you speaking when you're supposed to speak? All these kinds of things that come with a particular vision of the individual that is always already gendered in particular ways, that relates to their sexuality in particular ways. So it is effective to the extent that it became a part and parcel of the reformist work of colonialism, especially since the 19th century, where investment in this reform of body, intimacy, and so on has been powerful. But then I wanted to just come back to this successful and yet not successful, because oftentimes the pretenses of this reformist work that now we see continuing in some areas of development, some areas of humanitarianism, and so on, is never totalizing. When you do research, like I do, in different parts of the world, I work in Kenya, I work in Romania, you come to see that so many of these impositions, this kind of reform, sometimes picked up quite voluntarily in the sense that they promise some sort of participation in a global community. They're never absolute. They always go hand in hand with a combination of some older traditional things, beliefs that come to be reformed and reinterpreted and so on. So successful and not successful, even if we use the quotation marks around the word.
Maybe let's take a step back and have a look at some terms. We talked about sex, we talked about sexuality, we talked about gender. Can you quickly explain the difference between these terms?
I will, and then I will also tell you that I will hate myself for doing it, and I'll tell you why. So first of all, generally, the convention when we talk about these terms is more or less, and we need to have some working definition, even though it should never be cast in stone, and I'll explain why, is that sex usually refers either to the act of sexual pleasure. Sex has also been used in the past, but still used in some circles now to refer to gender as ascribed by biology. Then sexuality has typically referred to how the totality of your sexual desires, aspirations, pleasure, pains, nightmares, what have you, constitute you as an individual. But you see, already when I give you this definition, I hate myself, as I said before, because it's a very historically specific definition. It's a definition that we might want to actually question and look at its effects. What does it mean? What do we create in the world when we define and think of ourselves in those terms, right? I'm straight or I'm gay. Right? The presumption here is that what one does for sexual pleasure defines who you are at your innermost core. That is a historically specific form of understanding personhood, subjecthood. So, and then gender referring then to kind of the ways in which I think one inhabits a certain kind of matrix of gender. Oftentimes this has been related to the body. How is your body gendered? Whether through clothing, whether through biology, whether through various forms of practice and so on. But then, I can give examples of societies, pre-colonial societies that had nothing of the sort, where social difference was constituted way more in terms of generation and seniority, juniority, and hardly ever in terms that relate to gender. So I think it's good to know what these things mean in the world. But again, what I usually tell my students is let us not try to seek too much certainty in those definitions. Sometimes, even when we position, we want to act on the world, a world that's very complicated and has made these terms key battlefields. And then we want to say, well, no, your definition of gender is wrong. Your definition of sexuality is wrong. This is what they mean. I think that in that very act, there is a certain kind of arrogance already, even if that arrogance is meant for a certain kind of liberation, for a certain kind of anti-oppression work. And I say arrogance because it plays by the same kind of conceitedness of colonialism. No, you over there, you know nothing. You're ignorant. Let me tell you what those things are all about. I think that instead of that, we have also an obligation to understand and to pay attention to what these things mean in the world. These are not analytics. Sex, gender, sexuality, these are not analytics that we have as social scientists, or at least not anymore. They are terms that everybody in society uses in one way or another, which makes our work even more difficult.
Maybe to give an example, there is one in your paper, Queering Bodies. It's about a performance by the Kenyan artist Neo in Nairobi.
Neo is dressed in a white t-shirt and black pants, and rummages through a heap of clothes with an expression of exasperation and annoyance, and selects a striped orange and white tight-fitting dress. Neo proceeds to change into the dress in a way that avoids showing more than arms and legs. Once the dress is on and the t-shirt and pants are off, Neo puts on a pair of black high heels. As a curious crowd gathers around, Neo proceeds to change clothes several times, alternating between clothes that can be read as masculine and or feminine respectively. In the end, Neo changes into black pants, a black and white striped shirt, a waistcoat, sneakers, a tie and a hat. Neo packs the rest of the clothes on the floor into a rucksack, puts on a pair of spectacles and walks out of the camera frame.
So, what makes this performance stand out?
I keep coming back to this performance just to tell our listeners it refers to a queer activist from Kenya, Neo Muzangi, who organized this performance in the middle of the city, Nairobi. And I found it very powerful. My latest book has been on questions of homophobia and how these panics around homosexuality suddenly emerge, and sometimes with quite violent violent aftermath, violent effects. So Neo Muzangi's performance, that can also be seen as a video sort of performance on YouTube, is in a way playing with certain kind of collective anxieties. Part of the performance is this, as was described, dressing and undressing, creating this kind of, and playing with this ambiguity. Somehow gender is not in clothes, or you're trying to read my gender from my clothes, then good luck. So it's playing with this. But then there is a third part to the performance where the artists, activists go around and ask the people in the public, a real public that just gathers in this space to watch what's going on, and they confess their confusion. I don't know what's here. What are we dealing with? What is this? Who is this person? And growingly, as this confusion is being expressed, it turns into inquiries about neo-sexuality. Who does this person actually sleep with? And then I will tell you what this person is. So the presumption here, you see, coming back to your previous question about definitions, allowing them to emerge from a context like this, you suddenly end up with completely different definitions. In this case, the idea was that who the person sleeps with is truly who the person is. In other words, sexuality is the deeper truth of one's gender. And actually, from my interviews with gay men who are gender non-conforming, for example, and who have experienced violence, like mob violence in urban areas in East Africa, by simply walking through the street or passing through certain bus stations, which are these hubs of intense social life, and suddenly their bodies not being able to be read in particular normative ways, creating the same confusion, which can then lead to violence. But what was interesting about Neo's performance, which did not lead to violence, but did lead to confusion, is to actually see how these moments of panic have a double potentiality. On the one hand, they can make us so uncomfortable, so confused, that we need quick answers. We need to put our finger on what's going on there. And what creates that certainty? Well, violence. Yeah. And the same plays out with ethnic violence, other forms of violence. On the other hand, the confusion can be a wonderful moment. It could be a moment of learning. I don't understand what's going on here, but perhaps gender is more complicated. And I actually say there is another reading here. What people were watching is not something foreign to them. Indeed, a certain fluidization. But actually, if you study social life, and you don't have to go to Kenya to do it, you can do it right now in Europe when we look at the rise of a radical right, ultra-radical right. It's not so much that gender fluidity among artists such as Neo is actually rendering something unbearable. Like you have the norm that is there, and then here is somebody playing with the norm. To the contrary, what makes it so powerful, so uncomfortable, so inciting in a way of this kind of violent desire for certainty is the fact that it resonates. That oftentimes, if you look even at conservatives speaking about gender, what do they say? Men can no longer be men. They can no longer fulfill the traditional obligations of, household provider, because they have been emasculating by this and this and that. In other words, the gender binary, so to say, has already been rendered fluid in more ways than one by the historical context, economic, political, in which we live.
But it is interesting that as soon as you see a person, you have like this instinct to decide this is a man or this is a woman or this is someone who is like somewhere in between. Why is that?
This is a really important question, and I think that if we just come to ask that question that you just asked, even if sometimes we cannot get answers to it, we're already beginning to do something very important, a very important work. Why is that? My answer, my take on that would be that we have lived in a context that has made gender, like sexuality, an indispensable aspect of the self. Furthermore, it has inscribed gender on a certain relation to the body that is mediated through vision. There are wonderful philosophers writing about this, how in the Western world with enlightenment, from all the senses with which we engage the world, how did vision become the primary side, right? We don't smell the world, we don't touch the world, we do so at a lesser extent, those are the vulgar senses. We see the world. True objective scientists look at the world. And in a way, the foregrounding of this vision and the body as an object of vision has been part and parcel of a certain kind of ontology, a way of being in the world in Western modernity, and now a globalized Western modernity. So the incitement comes partially, I would say, from there, right? My ability to relate to you is seeing or reading. There's a beautiful way in Kenya, people say, kusoma mwili, I will read your body. But it means something else. I can read you for social status. Let's see how much money you have. How can I relate to you? But it's this idea of reading the body. And we relate to each other by reading each other's bodies. But I think it is important to ask ourselves, why? Is this just something natural, or is it something historically constituted? And if not, and if it is indeed historically constituted, then are there other ways in which we can relate to each other?
There is another example in your work, and I think it's interesting because there it isn't about, is this a man or is this a woman? But I think in the end, the judgments may be the same. It's about the Samburu.
When I began doing fieldwork in northern Kenya in 2005, I was quickly struck by a phenomenon that, until then, I had known nothing about. My interlocutors told me numerous stories about local young men who became rich by engaging in transactional sex or long-term, long-distance relationships with women from Western Europe. What generated this miraculous wealth was their ability to perform a particular idiom of ethnic sexuality for tourist consumption. Tourists recognized Maasai or Samburu so-called Morans or warriors by their traditional outfits of a red loincloth, beds, long braided hair, a spear and a club. Indeed, the image of the Ma-speaking Moran had become a best-selling brand of Kenya as a tourist destination. And, to the embarrassment of Kenya's leaders and its middle class, it also opened informal possibilities for Samburu to benefit from the commodification of their sexuality. An unintended counter-effect of such strategies was inter-ethnic violence. In conversations with Samburu and coastal residents, but also through archival research, I documented several instances of violence against Samburu male migrants on the coast. In most cases, vigilante groups of coastal young men attacked and killed Samburu men. I was surprised at first to learn that coastal residents saw Samburu, an otherwise marginalized group in Kenya, as stealing others' opportunities. More dominant ethnic groups from upcountry now owned land, hotels and other real estate at the coast and monopolized job markets. Samburu did neither.
So why are they a threat to the Kenyan man?
A few years ago, I purchased a postcard in Kenya, one of those postcards that you can buy, in tourist shops, at airports and so on, that has spelled out on it African warrior, and that had a young Samburu man dressed in traditional kind of clothes with beads and a spear and so on. And because I was for a long time doing research in Samburu, I tried to figure out who this person was and see how his image turned into this kind of brand of a particular niche of tourism. And what I found out in the Samburu villages up north, where I do field work, was that this young man had died in 1997 in interethnic violence at the coast to the Indian Ocean, while engaging in tourist performances, going to dance for tourists, trying to find relationships with white women, and so on. And this made me think, how is it possible that some form of an ethnic sexuality has become such a powerful, seductive brand, commodity brand of tourism in Kenya? And on the other hand, at the same time, it became such a lethal brand, a brand that kills. And here we come back to this idea of the body, of reading the body. And now it's claimed. I mean, oftentimes I would talk to Samburu men and say, well, this is a really colonial sort of thing. No, this is our culture, right? Because in a way, it became their collective capital. That capital, that ethnic sexuality that I have is in my body. But in order for them to market such a capital, they had to migrate. It's almost like it used to be a 2 days drive from northern Kenya to the coast where the tourists actually were. Mm-hmm. Nobody was going to northern Kenya. And at the coast, already since the 1980s, you had all kinds of so-called beach boys who were walking the beaches and trying to sell different kinds of souvenirs to the tourists. And suddenly these young men come. And they have success, and they become suddenly very wealthy. Some of them, not all of them, by marrying European women. It's probably a very well-known memoir written by a Swiss author, Device Masai, that is based on her relationship to a Samburu man. And that then produces all kinds of speculations. What is it truly that you have among young men, right? What is it truly that you have in your body that I don't have, that gets you that kind of wealth and not me? What is it really that you're using, that you're seducing these white women that I can't use myself? And in a context in which, under the President Daniel Arap Moi's authoritarian regime, there was extreme poverty. Competition over land had become very intense. Access to tourist resorts has become very contested. Suddenly, in these movements, xenophobic movements, the foreigner should go back home, this kind of logic. So if you're Samburu, you don't belong to the coast, go back home, sort of thing. They were targeted. Lots of these young men in 1997 were targeted by violence. And the idea there, I'm talking about the macabre spectacle of violence, where limbs are cut, and it's a quite macabre. But violence itself has a certain kind of logic that as anthropologists one tries to understand. And the idea here is that one creates this certainty in a context of ambiguity. How do you get that money and I don't? I want an answer. I want certainty. Violence often becomes the means to that answer. It's something in your body, therefore, your body gets killed, butchered, right? So here you have it. This young man had been killed in that violence and in horrific ways. And yet that man, if you go nowadays to Kenya, still figures as a brand of ethnic sexuality on these postcards. And I think it's important to think these things together, but what you see in them is again this idea that there is something in our bodies that is called sexuality, that, as I said, originated in a particular time in the West, is everywhere now, and it's also shaping the ways in which people understand their cultures as capital, as a possibility to make a future, and so on.
I found it interesting. Sex workers usually work like in the dark, or at least in Europe, we know that this is something that you don't see in broad daylight. Is there something different with the Samburu men and the way they express their work in Kenya?
So, well, here you have the male privilege that where my interlocutors in this case would actually say they would refuse to be called sex workers. Their idea is more that they have girlfriends, although they can also have one-night stands, right? Paid one-night stands. And when other Kenyans refer to them as, in derogatory ways, as sex workers, it is perceived as highly emasculating.
So we are back with definitions.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Do we have to talk more about sex and sexuality in the open so it loses this judgment part?
I think, somebody like Michel Foucault would tell us that we're not talking. We are talking extensively. We love to talk. I mean, look at reality TV show. We watch and so slept with so-and-so. So let's see what they now say about their experience, because then we learn something about their true self. It's less about how much we talk than how we talk. If we choose to simply embrace that sex and sexuality are, that they constitute us, something that paradoxically liberals and conservatives have no problem agreeing on, then there's little we have to learn. Then there is little one can do to imagine other forms of being, other worlds, and so on. If we, however, acknowledge that this is a historically constituted mode of being that, while dominant, continues to exist in parallel with myriad other forms of being, and those, again, I think, they're not in the places one expects them. Sometimes they're little expressions in everyday life that I, as an anthropologist, have often been told, like, are you for real? Is this this kind of serious stuff that you're supposed to research? Yes. This kind of trivial, seemingly sometimes vulgar, sometimes undignified ways of being. I do research with sex workers. Right? I'm interested in the way in which they understand the world, in which they build the world, a world that combines violence with possibility and pleasure and so on. If we pay attention to these things, we also gradually are able to experience ourselves differently, and with this, to slowly craft worlds that look differently.
You think you and I will see this world?
I think even there, it's a question of what we look at. If one wants this kind of rapid, tomorrow is no longer like today, oftentimes you end up with repetition. You have a revolution, right? The whole system has changed, but we use the very same terms that we used before to rebuild this world. I was born in Romania during communism, right? And I lived through the December 1989 revolution that then afterwards also led to the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. I remember the 1990s as a teen, as a time of immense possibility and transformative promise. The future will not look like the past period. That was the kind of spirit. Although the 90s were also a horrible time of poverty and other things. And what do we actually see now in the world? A return of a certain kind of the same. And from other perspective, it's not the same. But we rebuild the world with the same terms, with the same unquestioned grammars, because we're too stubborn, too arrogant to let go of certain definitions. I think that's a key. We imagine this world as completely different, a post-socialist, a post-colonial world, and so on, but rehearse the very same terms because we insist, again, on the certainty that certain definitions give us. And then everything is very slow. But on the other hand, again, my profession is to look at the detail, at the little possible. And there you do see change. There you can see promises. You can see, it's just not on the same scale as how would a radically different tomorrow look like.
So we just have to keep our eyes open to see the little differences every day.
I think the one political philosopher says it beautifully when he says that instead of politic of activity, like, if I act now and I act fast, something different will be tomorrow. We need also alongside it, we need a politics of patience, a certain kind of think carefully about the terms with which in your acting you try to build the tomorrow.
George Paul Meiu, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Unisonar, the podcast of the University of Basel. In the next episode, health expert Sonja Merten will discuss the stigma surrounding menstruation, why heart attacks in women are often misdiagnosed as panic attacks, and why we need more women in leadership positions to overcome the decade-old gender bias. We conducted the interview in German. See you soon.